In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the Johnson family was often regarded as the epitome of success and happiness. Paul and Sarah Johnson, both in their late 30s, lived in a large, well-kept home with their 2 children, a son named Ben and a daughter named Lily. From the outside, everything appeared perfect. Paul worked as a financial consultant, a job that provided his family with a comfortable, upper-middle-class lifestyle. Sarah stayed at home, taking care of the children and managing the household. Their children excelled in school, and the family was frequently seen at local events, always smiling and together. Neighbors would wave as they passed by, admiring the idyllic scene. However, behind the perfectly manicured front yard and the polished smiles, things were far from ideal. Paul, though seemingly successful, had become distant and cold in his marriage. He often worked long hours, leaving Sarah to handle the household and the children on her own. He became less engaged in family matters, retreating into his work and leaving Sarah feeling increasingly isolated. Sarah, on the other hand, was a devoted mother but struggled with her own personal demons. Over the years, her self-esteem began to erode. She had been an energetic, loving wife at the beginning of their marriage, but the years of emotional neglect and constant demands of motherhood took a toll. Despite her best efforts to maintain the perfect image of family life, Sarah found herself constantly battling feelings of loneliness and frustration. The tension between Paul and Sarah grew, with frequent arguments behind closed doors. Friends and family were unaware of the growing cracks in their relationship, because they continued to present the image of a happy, functioning family. The Johnsons were the kind of couple everyone admired, and no one suspected that beneath the surface their marriage was unraveling. Paul's work began to take precedence over everything else, and he became more indifferent to Sarah's emotional needs. Sarah, once a vibrant and hopeful woman, began to feel like a mere caretaker for Paul and the children. She would often stay up late at night, lying awake in bed, contemplating how things had gone so wrong. Over time, Sarah's growing unhappiness drove her to seek solace in her own way. She became more distant from her friends and family, not wanting anyone to question the perfect life she had outwardly built. She didn't know how to fix things with Paul, and she felt trapped. Leaving him seemed impossible. They were financially dependent on Paul, and she didn't want to uproot the children from their comfortable lives. Yet her inner turmoil was eating away at her, and she began to withdraw further into herself. Meanwhile, Paul was becoming restless. His work had taken over his life, and the intimacy in his marriage had all but vanished. He began to seek excitement elsewhere, and it wasn't long before he found it in the form of Emily, a colleague at his office. Emily was everything Sarah wasn't: bold, carefree, and exciting. Her presence lit a fire in Paul that had been absent from his marriage for years. The more time they spent together, the more he began to view Sarah not as a partner, but as an obstacle in his pursuit of happiness. As their affair progressed, Paul started to fantasize about a life without Sarah, one where he could be with Emily, free from the burdens of his failed marriage. What began as a brief escape turned into something more serious. Soon Paul was confiding in Emily about the problems in his marriage, discussing his frustrations with Sarah, and openly expressing how he wished things were different. Emily, who had her own motivations for being involved with Paul, was more than willing to listen. She sympathized with Paul's plight and began to suggest ways he could rid himself of the situation, urging him to take drastic action. In Emily's eyes, Paul was a means to an end, a wealthy, powerful man she could manipulate for her own benefit. Little did Paul know he was walking into a trap far more dangerous than he ever imagined. For months, Paul's affair with Emily remained a secret, but as the relationship deepened, the discussions about Sarah began to shift from casual complaints to more serious talk. Emily, always eager to keep Paul close, started to plant ideas in his mind, ideas that grew darker and more dangerous with each passing day. She knew how unhappy he was in his marriage, and she knew how much he resented Sarah. But Emily also knew that Paul's attachment to his family and his wealth could be the perfect starting point for an elaborate plan that would rid him of his wife and set him free. It wasn't long before Emily's conversations with Paul evolved into discussions about the future, about their future together. She promised him that if he could somehow get rid of Sarah, they could finally be together without the barriers of his marriage. It wasn't just about the romance for Emily, it was about the wealth and stability that came with Paul's lifestyle. She had always been attracted to men with power and money, and Paul was the perfect catch. But she had no intention of sharing him. She wanted everything: his life, his wealth, and his control over everything they would build together. As the affair continued, Emily started to subtly steer Paul's thoughts toward the idea of taking Sarah's life. At first, Paul was hesitant. He wasn't a murderer, or so he thought. But Emily was relentless. She would tell him how much happier he could be without Sarah, how he would no longer be trapped by the suffocating responsibilities of marriage. She planted seeds of doubt, telling him that Sarah would never let him go without a fight. Emily knew how to manipulate Paul, how to twist his desires and frustrations into something he could justify. The idea of getting rid of Sarah seemed to offer Paul a way out, a way to begin a new life with Emily. The more he thought about it, the more the notion started to feel like a viable solution to his problems. Paul began to focus less on the love he once had for Sarah and more on the freedom that Emily promised. Emily told him they could easily make Sarah's death look like an accident, a natural event. She suggested poisoning Sarah, making it look like she had suffered from a heart attack or some kind of sudden illness. It would be clean, untraceable, and best of all, it would leave Paul free to inherit everything. The two began to plan. They took their time, carefully thinking through every detail. They knew that if they acted too hastily, something would go wrong. They studied Sarah's routine, learning the ins and outs of her daily life. They knew she had a fondness for certain foods, dishes she often prepared for herself in the evenings when Paul was away. They began to source the poison, something undetectable, a substance that could mimic the symptoms of a heart attack, but would be difficult for medical professionals to detect. The poison had to be slow-acting, making Sarah feel ill but not immediately fatal, so that the death would seem like a natural occurrence. They also worked on creating alibis. Emily would make sure to have witnesses who could vouch for her whereabouts when Sarah passed away. Paul, too, would be out of town on a business trip, ensuring that he couldn't be tied to the scene. They knew that they had to make it look as if no one was involved, no one, except for a grieving husband who had no idea what was going on in his wife's final moments. But as their plan took shape, so did the risks. Every time they talked about it, Paul's conscience began to gnaw at him. The idea of actually killing Sarah felt more real, and the guilt began to settle in. But Emily reassured him, reminding him of the new life they could have once Sarah was gone. The more they spoke about it, the more Paul became convinced. His relationship with Emily had clouded his judgment, and the promises of a fresh start were too tempting to resist. The plan, once a distant fantasy, was now on the verge of becoming a deadly reality. But little did Paul know, as the plot unfolded, he wasn't just being manipulated by Emily, he was already becoming a pawn in a game that was far more twisted than he could ever have imagined. The day Sarah's life would end began as a typical day in the Johnson household, or so it seemed. Paul had told Sarah that he had an important business trip scheduled, an overnight stay from meetings that he couldn't afford to miss. He kissed her goodbye that morning, his usual expression of affection masking the anxiety brewing inside him. As Sarah went about her day, preparing lunch for the kids and keeping up with household chores, she had no idea that the very meal she was about to prepare would be her last. Paul had left early, ensuring that he was well away from the house before the plan went into motion. Emily, knowing how meticulous Paul was in arranging his life, had already begun her part of the plan. She had visited the Johnson house the night before, secretly slipping the poison into the food that Sarah would eat later that evening. She knew Sarah's routine well. By 7 p.m., she would sit down alone in the dining room to enjoy a quiet meal after putting the kids to bed. Emily had chosen the dish carefully, Sarah's favorite, a homemade pasta with a rich, creamy sauce. The meal was comforting, something Sarah often turned to after a long day. It was the perfect disguise. Sarah, blissfully unaware, continued with her evening. She tucked the children into bed, kissed them goodnight, and moved to the dining room, ready to relax. The pasta sat steaming on the table, just as she liked it. She had no reason to suspect anything was amiss. As she ate, she began to feel an unfamiliar sensation in her stomach, a slight discomfort that she brushed off as nothing more than indigestion. But as the minutes passed, the discomfort grew stronger. Her heart raced. She felt lightheaded, as though the world around her was spinning. It wasn't long before she stood up, trying to steady herself, but the room seemed to tilt as she stumbled toward the kitchen. By the time she reached for the phone, her vision blurred and the pain intensified. She realized something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't summon the strength to call for help. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her body weakening with each passing second. She tried to steady herself, leaning against the kitchen counter, but the disorientation was overwhelming. The poison had started to take its toll. Sarah collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, her body completely under the poison's control. The symptoms were subtle at first: dizziness, weakness, and a tightness in her chest, but they quickly escalated into full-blown agony. It wasn't a sudden collapse, it was a slow, agonizing descent. She had just enough time to grasp that something wasn't right, but not enough time to understand the extent of the danger she was in. Meanwhile, Paul had been in contact with Emily, waiting for the moment when Sarah would be incapacitated enough for him to make his next move. He had planned to return home later that evening, just in time to play the grieving husband, shocked by his wife's sudden and tragic death. He had made sure everything looked perfect for his return. He would be able to call the authorities, pretend to be devastated, and give the appearance of having nothing to do with the events. Emily, as per their plan, would provide her alibi, ensuring that there was no evidence linking her to the crime. But as the evening wore on and the hours passed, Paul's anxiety began to rise. He had checked in with Emily multiple times, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that something wasn't going according to plan. He hadn't received any word from her for a while, and as time stretched on, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were going awry. His mind raced with thoughts of what could go wrong. What if Sarah survived? What if the authorities found out the truth? Back at the house, Sarah's condition worsened rapidly. The poison was slowly taking its toll, but she still had moments of clarity. In her fading state, she managed to reach the phone and dial 911. But as the phone rang, she could barely hold the receiver in her trembling hands. The operator's voice seemed to grow fainter, and her ability to speak became limited. Her last words, barely audible, were desperate, but they never reached the operator in full. By the time the emergency responders arrived, Sarah was already dead, her body lying motionless on the kitchen floor. When Paul returned home, he was met with a scene of shock and confusion. He found his wife's body, and the investigators were already on site, trying to piece together what had happened. To everyone, it seemed like a tragic, sudden heart attack. Everything appeared to fit. The cause of death would be ruled as natural causes with no signs of foul play. Paul played his role perfectly, showing up just in time to express his devastation and confusion. He was the loving husband, the grieving father, and the man who had lost the mother of his children. Yet, even as he wept for the life he had supposedly lost, something in the air had changed. The perfect plan he and Emily had crafted seemed to be unfolding without a hitch. But there was something the police had overlooked, something that was far from perfect. The investigators were beginning to ask questions, and though Paul had managed to escape suspicion for now, the cracks in the story were beginning to show. What seemed like a perfect crime was slowly beginning to unravel. Detective James Hargrave was no stranger to cases that appeared straightforward at first glance but were layered with complexity upon closer inspection. When he was assigned to investigate Sarah Johnson's death, the case seemed like just another tragic incident, the kind that could be explained away by a sudden, unexpected heart attack. The scene was clean, there were no signs of struggle, and nothing appeared out of the ordinary. But something about the circumstances nagged at Hargrave. Paul's behavior was unsettling. His composure after finding his wife's body seemed off too calm, too rehearsed for someone who had just lost a loved one. It was as if the grief wasn't genuine, but rather a performance. The investigators had no reason to doubt Paul's initial statements. He had explained that he had been away on business and had returned to find Sarah unresponsive. He seemed genuinely devastated, a man caught in a tragic moment. But Hargrave's instinct told him there was more to the story. He knew that grief didn't always look the way it was portrayed in movies, but Paul's demeanor raised enough suspicion for the detective to dig deeper. Hargrave started by questioning the people who had known the Johnsons' neighbors, friends, and co-workers. No one had seen any signs of trouble in the marriage, but several people mentioned hearing loud arguments between Paul and Sarah in the weeks leading up to her death. Neighbors described Sarah as appearing increasingly withdrawn, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman they had known. Her isolation, combined with the rising tensions in her relationship, painted a picture that didn't fit with the idea of a sudden, natural death. As Hargrave dug further into Sarah's past, he discovered that there were no medical records supporting Paul's claim that she had a history of heart problems. There were no signs of any pre-existing condition that would have caused such a fatal heart attack. The medical examiner had ruled the cause of death as cardiac arrest, but with no definitive proof of a heart condition, it seemed too convenient. Hargrave also learned that Sarah had recently been to her doctor for a routine checkup and had been given a clean bill of health. Her death, though tragic, was suspicious, and the detective's gut told him there was something more at play. Hargrave wasn't one to rely solely on instinct, so he began examining the financial records of the Johnson family. He soon uncovered a significant life insurance policy that Paul had recently taken out on Sarah. The policy was sizable, and to make matters even more suspicious, Paul had increased the coverage just before Sarah's death. This was a red flag that sent the case into a different direction. The detective couldn't ignore the fact that a man had stood to gain a substantial sum of money from his wife's sudden passing. A deeper look into Paul's finances revealed a pattern of behavior that was consistent with someone trying to eliminate an obstacle in order to secure a future. There were substantial withdrawals from their joint accounts around the time of Sarah's death, and a recent unexplained purchase of a more luxurious car, an odd expense for a man who supposedly had just lost his wife. This led Hargrave to believe that Paul's life wasn't the tragic loss it seemed to be, but rather the result of a calculated decision. The detective also took a closer look at Paul's relationship with Emily, the woman who had been a consistent presence in Paul's life in the months leading up to Sarah's death. Though Emily had an airtight alibi, she was reportedly with friends during the time of Sarah's death. Hargrave could sense something off about her involvement. Emily was the perfect accomplice, intelligent, persuasive, and most importantly, someone who had the same motives as Paul. It didn't take long for the detective to realize that Emily was more than just a colleague or a friend. She had played a part in manipulating Paul into believing that killing Sarah was the only way forward. Hargrave began to piece together the timeline of the affair. It had begun months before Sarah's death, with Emily subtly feeding Paul ideas about his marriage and how to escape it. The detective discovered that Emily had a history of exploiting men with wealth and status, using them for her own gain. Her past was filled with red flags, failed relationships, manipulative behavior, and a clear pattern of getting involved with wealthy individuals, only to move on once she had secured her desired outcome. Emily had no love for Paul. She had only been after his money, and she had carefully orchestrated a plan to ensure that she would benefit from Sarah's death. Hargrave now had enough to confront Paul. He called him in for questioning, expecting to break him down. But Paul, still playing the role of the grieving husband, stuck to his story. He was the innocent man who had lost everything. He swore that he had no idea what had happened to Sarah and claimed that he would never harm her. Yet, as Hargrave laid out the evidence, the insurance policy, the strange withdrawals, and the growing evidence of his affair with Emily, Paul's calm demeanor began to crack. The detective knew that the case was far from over, but with each piece of evidence, it was becoming clearer that Sarah's death had been no accident. It had been carefully orchestrated, a tragic end to a marriage filled with lies, deceit, and greed. With the investigation in full swing, Hargrave knew that the truth was beginning to surface, and soon the toxic couple would be exposed for what they had done. The case that had seemed so simple at first was now a web of manipulation and betrayal, and Paul and Emily were at the center of it all. The detective just needed to keep pressing, and the walls would soon close in on them. As the investigation reached its climax, the pressure on Paul and Emily began to mount. Detective Hargrave knew that the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. He had already gathered the key pieces of evidence: the life insurance policy, Paul's suspicious financial transactions, and his increasing detachment from his wife in the months leading up to Sarah's death. Now it was time to build a case that would link Paul and Emily together, solidifying their roles in the elaborate plan that had led to Sarah's untimely death. Hargrave knew that Emily was the key. Despite her seemingly perfect alibi, she had played a central role in manipulating Paul. It wasn't just about an affair, it was about a carefully laid out plan to rid Paul of his wife and secure the wealth that would come with her death. Hargrave focused on Emily's background, uncovering a series of relationships where she had used men for financial gain. Each of these men had fallen victim to her charms, only to be discarded once she had gotten what she wanted. Her motives were clear, and her involvement in Sarah's murder seemed almost inevitable. To tighten the noose around both Paul and Emily, Hargrave interviewed Emily's friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. A key breakthrough came when one of Emily's former colleagues came forward with damning information. The colleague revealed that Emily had confided in her about the affair with Paul months before Sarah's death, even hinting at how easy it would be to dispose of Sarah in a way that would leave no trace of foul play. The colleague had dismissed Emily's comments at the time as nothing more than a twisted joke, but in hindsight, it was clear that Emily had been laying the groundwork for the murder long before the poison was administered. This revelation gave Hargrave the evidence he needed to take the case to the next level. He contacted Paul and Emily separately, bringing them in for further questioning. Paul, still confident in his innocence, maintained his story. He stuck to the narrative that he had returned home to find his wife dead, that he was unaware of any wrongdoing. But Hargrave had the upper hand. The detective slowly revealed the evidence, piece by piece, allowing Paul to see that his alibis were full of holes, and that his actions over the past few months had painted a clear picture of guilt. When Hargrave confronted Paul with the details of his affair with Emily, something in Paul's demeanor changed. His facade of innocence began to crack, and for the first time his nerves showed. The detective pressed harder, questioning him about the life insurance policy, the large withdrawals, and the sudden expenses that had cropped up around Sarah's death. Paul grew defensive, his excuses growing more erratic, but Hargrave's calm persistence wore him down. Then came the bombshell. Hargrave presented a recording of a conversation between Emily and Paul, secretly recorded by one of Emily's former colleagues. In the conversation, Paul and Emily discussed their plans to dispose of Sarah, outlining exactly how they would make it appear as if Sarah had died of natural causes. The recording was a smoking gun, proof that both Paul and Emily had been complicit in orchestrating Sarah's death. At that moment, Paul's resistance crumbled. He realized that the walls had closed in on him, and there was no way out. The truth was undeniable. In a moment of desperation, Paul finally admitted his role in the murder, though he still tried to justify his actions. He claimed that Sarah's emotional instability had become unbearable, and Emily had convinced him that they would be better off without her. He spoke of his frustrations with his marriage, his feelings of being trapped, and how Emily had promised him a new life, one where he could be free to do as he pleased. But his confession did little to mitigate the horror of his actions. Paul had planned his wife's death with a cold calculation, and Emily had been the mastermind pulling the strings. When Hargrave turned his attention to Emily, she initially maintained her calm composure, denying any involvement. But as the evidence against her mounted Paul's confession, the recording, the financial trail, Emily's confidence began to unravel. She denied everything, claiming that she was only trying to help Paul through a difficult time. But the detective knew better. The woman who had meticulously plotted to murder Sarah for her own gain could no longer hide behind her charm. Emily, too, was arrested. As the case went to trial, the details of the toxic couple's plan became public, and the community was left in shock. Paul and Emily had appeared to be ordinary people living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, but behind closed doors, they had orchestrated a murder for the sake of money and freedom. The trial was a spectacle, with both defendants facing the consequences of their actions. The evidence was overwhelming, and neither Paul nor Emily was able to avoid the truth. Sarah Johnson's family was left devastated by the loss of their mother, who had been taken away by those she had trusted most. The betrayal was almost too much to comprehend. As the court convicted both Paul and Emily of first-degree murder, they were sentenced to life in prison, where they would remain for the rest of their lives. The case of Sarah Johnson became a grim reminder of how far people would go when driven by greed, and how carefully orchestrated plans could unravel in the end. It was a tragedy for Sarah, her children, and the community that had once looked up to the Johnsons as the perfect family. The truth, however, had finally come to light, exposing the darkness behind their carefully crafted facade.